Hello everyone, welcome to day 3 of the Stitch Together project. We are live, I think, just checking that's uploaded. Yes, so we're live. So thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for everyone who's joined in over the past 2 days. It's been awesome to see all your designs coming in, keep them coming. I saw a really cool boot someone's done, and a tent, and a peacock, so that's awesome. Thank you so much for sending them in. Keep on sending them in. I think some of you are going a little bit quicker than I expected, so some of you look like you've almost finished, which is great. I mean, I was planning on sharing a stitch a day, so if you do end up finishing, feel free to start another one. That's great. Good morning Holly, good morning Michaela, good morning Kate. Great to see you all. So in this video I'm going to be covering seeding stitches and cross stitch, but before I do that, I've put up a post yesterday just to say ask me a question if you've got any questions about my own work, about the projects you're working on, or just about embroidery in general. Then please feel free to ask me a question. I've got a few on my laptop that I'll go through, but also if you're watching live, then again feel free to ask, and I'll try and answer as many as possible. So yeah, we'll just get started. First question that came through, I'll just check here, sorry, was from Jane, and she said, what are the best options for displaying your piece when it's complete? So I will actually be covering this in a couple of my videos as the week goes on, but it's a great question and something to think about as you start your embroidery project, especially if you're going to be sending it to someone or giving it as a gift. So there's 3 ways that I would recommend. The first one is actually just to use the embroidery hoop as a frame. So these hoops are actually great for hanging. You can actually slot a little bit of thread or maybe a ribbon or something through your embroidery hoop and you can hang them to display them. But the thing you need to do is obviously tidy the fabric at the back of your hoop. So this is one embroidery that I've done for a workshop for a class I'm teaching. And what I suggest people to do, I'll do a more in-depth tutorial on this on another day, but I often suggest people to sort of do a gathering stitch around the back and pull it tight so that the fabric is secure and it's nice and neat, and then that's perfect for hanging. But obviously if you've got an embroidery hoop and it's the only one you've got and you actually want to work on more projects, then this isn't ideal because you'll be securing your embroidery in this hoop and then you won't be able to use it anymore. So another option is to wrap your fabric around a piece of card ready for it to be framed. Okay, so the trick with this is getting quite a strong piece of card. Now this is one I've got for a teaching workshop and the card is a little bit flimsy, so you can see that it bends quite easily. But the idea with this is you simply wrap the fabric around the card, lace the fabric around the back, pull it tight so this sits nice and flat, and then you can slot it into a frame, which is quite nice. But I'll be covering that again in another workshop, so if you want to learn how to do that, then absolutely I'll show you guys. Third option, I'll just get my piece. You might have to think quite far ahead for this one, but another option is to actually put your embroidery onto an item of clothing. So here you can see I've got a little boat, and what I've done here is I've actually stitched this boat onto a different piece of fabric and then I've appliqued the design onto this top. So this is great for adding detail to your designs. If you're doing something quite heavy, I'd always recommend that you stitch it first onto a separate piece of fabric and then stitch it onto your clothes. If you're just doing like little details like little flowers or something, you could do them directly onto your clothes. But yeah, this is another option if you're interested. The only thing to think about if you're going to do this, obviously this is going to be worn, so you need to make sure that the colours you're using are colour fast. You can tell if they're colour fast because they usually say on them. So I know that DMC, which is this thread here, this is colour fast. And you can just Google it, check on their websites. And colour fast basically means that the colour isn't going to run if you put it in the wash. And some of the cheaper versions aren't necessarily colour fast, so you just have to double check that. So that's 3. I've actually got one more, which I've just remembered, and I'm actually going to be doing a video about this oops, on Friday. I don't know if you noticed on my little schedule, I put about my great Uncle Fred's embroidered World War One postcards. I think that's right. Which are these. I'm going to be talking about these in more detail on Friday. But this is another way of displaying your work, and it's simply using card as a frame, and you basically stick your embroideries to the card, and then you can create a nice little frame for them, and you can pop them in the post. So that's great, but I'll talk in more detail about that on Friday. Don't want to give too much away. So next question, thanks for that, Jane. Michaela says, loving the tutorial so far. How long have you been an embroiderer? What's your favourite stitch, and why did you choose embroidery over textiles? So, firstly, how long have I been an embroiderer? 5 years, I'd say. I studied hand embroidery at the Royal School of Needlework, so I actually did a degree in hand embroidery, which you can do. So that was in 2012. And the reason I chose that course, I actually did textile A-level, and I went to a few university courses to look at the textile courses, and they were all great, but I felt like I wanted to learn something in depth. A lot of the courses were offering you skills in every single area of textiles, but it was like a little bit of each, which is great, but I just felt like I wanted to learn something really well, and I just Googled textile courses. It's as simple as that. So I Googled textile degree, I think it was, that I put in, and it came up with the Royal School of Needlework, and I thought, I'll have a go, I'll go to the interview, see what happens. And I got in, and the rest is history, really. So I haven't had a dying desire to be an embroiderer ever since I was a child, but it's just something that I've picked up as I've gone along, and something that I've enjoyed. So that is really why I started it. What is my favourite stitch? Oh gosh. There's a stitch, well, I'd say my favourite technique is blackwork embroidery. So actually in embroidery there's lots of different techniques. So what we're doing is surface embroidery techniques. So this could come under the crewel work or Jacobean work technique. So they're sort of traditional English names for the embroideries. But blackwork is a technique which is essentially, I describe it like a really fancy cross stitch. So just like in cross stitch where you use an open weave fabric, in blackwork you also use an open weave fabric, and it's all about patterns and counting. And the idea is that you create repeated patterns and you shade them to create designs, and you can change the colours and change the thickness of your thread to change the style of the design. So actually if you go on my website you can see 2 of my pieces that I've done using the blackwork technique. So there's the Susie portrait, and there's also a self-portrait which is of me when I was a child, and I've done both of them using the blackwork technique. So thanks for that question, Michaela. I had a couple come through on Instagram. Where have I put my notes? There they are. So one person said, how long, or they said, I really like the Susie portrait on your website. How long did that take you to stitch? So thanks for that. Gosh, it took about 6 months, in all honesty. Not full on stitching every day. This was sort of on and off. For those of you who don't know, I'm slowly but surely working on a project of self-portraits of people in Coventry. So they're people who are adults, but they're giving me portraits of them as kids, and I'm stitching their portraits for them. So it's sort of a self-project, so it's taking a little while because I'm doing it alongside all my other work. So the Susie portrait was one of them. Susie is my godmother, and I also did an interview with her where she just talked about her childhood and her inspirations. So you can watch that on my website. But yeah, it took quite a long time. So it's one of those, it's quite a big piece, and as the piece progresses you realise you need to add something else, and it kind of slowly takes longer and longer and longer. So that's that one. I'll just check if we've got any more questions coming in online. Thanks for all your questions. think that's about it. Does anyone have any burning questions that they want to ask me right now? If not, I might just get on with seeding stitches and cross stitch. Just wait a few seconds. No, cool. So in this next video tutorial, I'm going to cover seeding stitch and cross stitch. They're both really simple, but there's a few tricks for you to kind of add detail with these and make it look quite effective. So sometimes the simplest stitches are the ones that can actually work really nicely in designs and really make or break designs. I've actually got an example of seeding here. So this is another one of mine. So seeding is this stitch here. So they, again, just like all stitches, it's in the name. Seeding stitches, stitches that look like seeds that have been scattered on the ground. And then cross stitch is literally a cross. So again, I don't think I mentioned this yesterday, but when we were doing satin stitch, the reason satin stitch is called satin stitch, well actually I don't know if this is the reason, but it basically is a stitch that creates a satin sheen. So you might not have been able to tell if you were using mixed colours because it looks quite stripy, but if you just use one colour, it shows up quite clearly and it actually creates nice sort of shiny sheen when you do your stitches, really neat. So if we go back to this one, you can see in that blue flower, hopefully, there's a little bit of a shine and a shimmer to it. Don't know if that's picking up. But yeah, so we'll get started with those. Again, like I said yesterday and the day before, scissors and needles are sharp, so please sew responsibly. And yeah, I'll just turn this camera around. If you've got any more questions as we go, feel free to just type them up and post them. I'll try and answer as many as I can as we're stitching. And then I just make sure that's set. All right, so you might be able to see here that I've finished my satin stitch. I've actually added satin stitch to the little basket and to the bottom of the hot air balloon, and I've used the stripy technique. And you can also see that I've added crosses to one of the sections of my hot air balloon. So that's where we're going to be starting first. All right. Now if you're working on any of the other designs that I've shown you, so if you're working on the PS I made this design, obviously you can do some cross stitches on these crosses here. On the other designs, there aren't actually sections for you to do cross stitch, but what I was thinking is if you want, you could add them into the background as a decoration. On this piece, there isn't a cross stitch, but there is seeding stitches. So that's what these lines are here. And again, in the hot air balloon, I've decided to add some into some of the segments. So that's fine as well. And again, feel free to pause as we go so you can catch up with what we're doing. And if you're just joining us, welcome. Thanks for joining. This will be available on YouTube after we're done. So if you miss anything, you can just catch up there. Okay, so we're going to start with a cross stitch. And like I said, it's literally in the name. It's a cross, and that's all there is to it. So I'm going to use pink thread because that matches the segment. And I'm going to get another piece of thread that's the length of my forearm. About 30 centimetres. Might be able to hear a strimmer in the background. And then I'm going to separate my strands just as before. I'm going to take 3 strands of thread. Okay, and then I'm going to group these 3 together. And I've just closed the window so it's not as noisy. I don't know if you could hear that. Right, next thing's next. I am going to thread my needle, so I'm going to hold the needle by the sharp end. I'm going to wrap the thread around, pinch it and push it through. Now with this technique, I'm just going to use a knot at the end of my thread And I'm going to bring my needle up through the back of my fabric so the knot lays flat on the back. So I'm not going to cut it away for this one. So I'm going to start with this one at the bottom. Bring my needle up at the end of one of the cross stitch lines. And then bring my needle back down so it covers the line. Next, I'm going to bring my needle up at the end of the other line and bring my needle back down so it covers the line. And you might be thinking, why are you teaching us such a simple stitch? But the truth is, it's actually a really great stitch to add detail to design. So this one, I've only got one section of the cross, so I'm just going to do one stitch. Now, if you want to be really neat with this, you can make sure that all your vertical stitches lay underneath and all your sort of horizontal stitches, I know it's not exact because they change direction, all your horizontal stitches lay over the top. And that's all there really is to it with cross stitch. But again, like I said, it's a great one for adding detail. And sometimes it's the simplest stitches that make the most impact. So I've just done a few cross stitches in this design, but you can add as few or as many as you like. You can maybe make some smaller ones in between and use less strands of thread. So you could use one strand of thread so they look thinner or more petite. Like so. You might have seen cross stitch used mostly on open weave fabric. So what I mean by that is fabric that has got holes in, essentially. So this is a closed weave fabric, so you can't see the holes within the weave. So most fabrics, they're woven, and that basically means they've got threads going in this direction and threads going in that direction, which interlock. And that's how the fabric stays secure. Whereas there are some fabrics, I mean, this is plastic, so it's a bit hard to tell, but in some fabrics, the threads go that way, the threads go that way, but they're not pulled tight, so you can actually see the holes within the fabric. And for cross stitch, quite often, people use these kind of structured designs to create their own designs. And if I just unthread this now, they'll stitch using a repeated pattern of crosses. This might not work because it's a bit thick, but they essentially stitch like this through the holes and they create a repeated cross stitch pattern across their design. Let's see if you can see that. But it doesn't, so this stitch doesn't just have to be used on an open weave fabric, it can be used on a closed weave fabric as well. Again, it's up to you. For those of you who are whizzing away with your designs, feel free to add some more detail or add something to the background if you like. Or you can start a new one if you've got enough fabric. That's fine. I'm going to be showing a different stitch each day, but you don't have to use all the stitches I'm showing you. It's just an option. But I quite like this one just to add a little bit of detail. So now I think what I'm going to do is add some more crosses, but only use 2 strands of thread in my needle. And you'll be able to see just how much of a difference using less strands make. Okay, so I've finished with this piece of thread. I'm just going to weave it through the back of my stitches like I've showed you before, just a couple of times. And then I'm going to cut that away. So again, if you're watching and you've just joined us, feel free to ask questions as we go. And you don't have to draw on the crosses onto your fabric. If that helps you, then please do. But if you'd like to do it freehand, that's also fine. So I'm going to do this next one freehand. And I'm going to only use 2 strands of thread this time. And if you use less strands, obviously the stitches look a bit thinner. And it's a good technique for adding a bit of definition to your design. So I've got 2 strands here of the pink. Thread my needle. Now every time I use thin strands of thread, I always go down to a smaller needle, just because the needle makes a hole as you bring it through the fabric, and if the hole is a lot bigger than the thread, then quite often the thread pulls through or you can still see the hole. So actually, for the purpose of this, I'm going to move to a number 7 needle. So this is what you've probably got. You can see that's just a bit smaller. Pinch, push. Oops. Try again. How many of you have mastered threading your needle yet? Takes a few goes to get it right. Thanks, Carissa. Carissa said the crosses look cute. I agree. So now we're going to do more crosses. I'm going to do them freehand this time, and I'm going to intersperse them in between these ones. But as I'm using less strands of thread, it should hopefully give it a little bit of definition. So I think I will pop one here. And if you want to be really precise, you can measure exactly how big each cross is, so they're all exact. But I personally think they look nice if they're a bit more random and spread out. So as you can see, that's quite obvious. It's a bit thinner, that thread. So we're adding just a bit more definition, and if you want, you can go down to 1 strand, and that will make even more of a difference. I think I'm just going to put 1 line in there, so it looks like the pattern is continuing round. Put 1 here. And the great thing about doing it freehand is you can kind of make it up as you go along. So you can add some in, but if you think they don't look good, you can take them out. Whereas if you've drawn them on, you can't exactly rub them out. So here we are. Feel free to pause as we go on this video if you're stitching along with me. But if you're just watching because you like to watch, that's absolutely fine. It's been nice having people join me every morning. I think I'm going to do 1 more here. And I'm just angling my needle underneath that blue stitch, so it looks like the cross is going underneath. Like so. Oops. Okay. So I might add a few more in later, but that gives you a general idea of what that could look like. Okay, so next I'm just going to weave that bit of thread through the back and then carry on with seeding stitches. Now my top tip for embroidery is to always weave as you go. It's quite tempting to just leave the weaving until the end, but trust me, if you get to the end and you've got 20 different strands of thread to weave through the back of your stitches, you're not going to want to do it. So I always recommend that you weave as you go. I'll do that one more time. And that way everything's kept nice and neat and you don't have to worry about your threads getting tangled. Get that away. Okay, so that is cross stitch. And again, you can do this in any segments, or you can just add them wherever you like if you want. I did think about maybe doing stars across the top, or just some sort of detail around the back. Right, next we are going to move on to seeding stitches. And I'm going to do this in this green segment here. But I'm not going to draw them on, and I'll show you why in a second. So first I'm going to get a piece of green thread, length of my forearm, and I'm going to take one strand of thread, and I'm just going to start with one strand to begin with, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to thread this up and tie a knot in the end. And again, I'm just going to bring my thread up through the back. Sometimes when I use one strand of thread, the knot always pulls out because it's so small. So sometimes what I do is I weave the thread through the back of my stitches first, just so I definitely know that that knot is not going anywhere. Give it a little tug just to check, and then I can begin stitching. So before I do, I'm just going to show you my example again. This is a Blackberry design that I use to teach workshops with. Now these are the seeding stitches I've used here. And as you can see, I've stitched more stitches here and less as we've gone up the shape. And this is a great way of adding shading to your shape without having to do lots and lots of satin stitch or lots and lots of a really heavy stitch. So what I'm going to do with this design is I'm going to have less stitches on this side, but more as we get to this side. And also what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one strand of thread on this side and gradually increase the strands of thread that I'm using as we get closer to the middle. So I'll show you what I mean. Now these are going to be random, and again, like I said before, seeding stitches, they're essentially supposed to look like seeds that have been scattered on the ground. So you can imagine you've just thrown a load of seeds on the ground and they've all fallen randomly. So you don't need to think too much about where you're putting them. But they're just straight stitches. They're just lines. Now I'm spreading them out at a reasonable distance on this side. My needle's just come undone. And it takes a bit of patience just to get going with this. And it's okay, completely okay to jump around as well. As long as you're in a small section. And you want to keep your stitches roughly the same length. Obviously you don't have to measure it. But like that one's quite long, so I think I'm going to take that one out and do it a little bit smaller to match the others. And you can always turn your hoop around as well. You don't have to hold it the right way up all the time. Just hold it in the direction that works best. Okay, so I've got a few there. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to weave this thread through the back of my stitches, cut it away, and start again with 2 strands of thread in my needle. And this time I'm going to do the stitches slightly closer together. So, 1. If you're just joining us, I did answer some of your questions before, but obviously if you've got any more questions, feel free to pop them in a comment and I'm more than happy to answer them as we go or at a later date. Oops, I think that knot is probably big enough to carry on. So this time, as I go up the middle of the design, I'm going to put my stitches slightly closer together. And now this is quite a small shape at the bottom, so we're not going to be able to fit many in. Okay, so this is slightly thicker stitches because we're using 2 strands of thread. They're going in random directions. And if you're stitching and you think, actually I need to come back and add another one, then that's also fine. You can kind of just play it by ear and see what you think. Okay. And add one more in. I think I'm going to add one more here. Hi Joanna. Joanna says, my daughter is doing the raw design and wonders what stitch she could use to fill in the face of the cat. Great question. So these lines here are for seeding stitches. So you can actually fill in the whole shape using seeding stitches if you want to. You could use this technique and fill more in this section and fill quite a heavy amount in this section and then less as you go around. Or you can leave it blank. You don't have to fill it in if you don't want to. Or you can add some French knots, which I'll show you on another day. It's up to you really, just get creative. You can use satin stitch if you want, which is the stitch that I use to do the ears. But because it's quite a big shape, you might use up a lot of thread. So I'd recommend using the seeding stitches. And if you want to fill out more of the face, just spread them around a bit more. You could maybe use orange seeding stitches and then use black or a darker colour for these ones in the centre to add a bit of definition. Hope that helps. Okay, so I've done the section with the 2 strands of thread down the middle, and then along this side I'm going to use 3 strands of thread and I'm going to put my stitches very close together. Now the bigger the shape you use, the more effective this technique will be. As this is quite a small shape, it's a bit harder to get a strong definition, but as you can see with this shape, it's a lot easier to spread out your stitches because the shape is just that bit longer. Okay, so for this one I'm going to use 3 strands of thread, so I should have 3 strands left in this piece of thread, but I'll just check. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Regroup. And I'm going to go back to my big needle just so you can see. And then I'm going to do quite a lot of stitches just down this side of the design. So I'll start here, fill them in. Doesn't matter what direction they go in. Just keep them random. And I'm actually using variegated thread. So that basically is a type of thread that changes colour as you stitch. So I'll just show you. So again, you can get these in Hobbycraft or wherever you've bought your threads from. They usually have them. So this is, again, is one really long piece of thread, but it changes from dark green to light green, which gives quite a nice effect as you stitch, especially if you're doing a satin stitch. As you sew, it will eventually get lighter and lighter. So it's quite a nice thing to have if you've got them. If you've not, you can create the same effect just by changing the thread you're using. Okay. And again, this is a great stitch to just add detail to anything. You can add decoration to the background if you want loads of spots or lines in the back of your design. This is a great stitch to use. Add one in there. Pop it down. I think that's okay. I'm quite happy with that. I think on my next one I might spread out the first row of stitches up a little bit more, just so it's really obvious. But I think you can kind of get the general idea that it's thicker at this side and slightly thinner at that side. But obviously you can disperse it as you would like. This stitch, so the seeding stitch, is also a great one to use to add detail to flowers and petals, and I often use this when I'm just doing leaves, because sometimes the leaves are thin lines and you don't actually need to do a really heavy stitch to create them. So for this one I'd just do one straight stitch and here maybe I'd do 1 or 2 straight stitches just to create that line. And then again, with the PS I made this design, you can add obviously the crosses, but you could also add little straight stitches. These dots here are ready for French knots or for beads, if you've got any beads. And that's just another idea. So I hope that's been helpful. If anyone's got any burning questions, feel free to just post them now or post them as we go. I'm more than happy to answer them all at a later date. I hope that's been helpful. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll see you again tomorrow. We're going to be covering chain stitch and lazy daisies tomorrow. So tune in for that if you're interested. And yeah, if you're just joining us, this is going to go live onto YouTube and it will be on the group as well. So if you've missed anything, feel free to catch up there.